property of sound waves. So now this is where it gets more interesting. If we're talking about a periodic wave, a longitudinal wave that repeats itself, we talked about the wavelength, the distance it takes for it to get to the same point in the cycle, and how does that relate to frequency? Well, the speed and the wavelength tell us what the frequency is, and this is the formula for it. It's the speed of sound divided by the wavelength. Just to give you an example of what frequency is, so let's think about like the low end of a kick drum or a bass guitar, what you'd consider low end. It's usually between 40 and 60 hertz. Hertz meaning cycles per second. A voice, probably more noticeable between 800 to 4,000 hertz. A cymbal, somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 12,000. You know, the sparkly part of a cymbal. The typical human being can hear from 20 hertz all the way up to 20,000 hertz. That's if you have good hearing. As you age, you start losing your high frequency, or if you listen to loud music a lot, you start losing that capability. Okay, so what is a frequency of 6 inches? We're trying to figure out what the frequency is for a half a foot. So 6 inches is about this long. At speed of 1,130 feet per second, ends up being about 2,200, give or take, cycles, right? So it's 2.2 kilohertz. And we talked about that's probably like the mid-range of a human voice. It's actually kind of a harsh frequency in singers' voices. What is the low E string on a bass guitar? 40 hertz. What's the length of the cycle? If you go through my little calculation here, you'll see that it's about 28 feet long. So think about it. What we're talking about is an air disturbance where it actually repeats itself. One wavelength at 40 hertz is the length of this room. Okay, so now let's talk about a real sound, say a mix of a song, which would have high frequencies and low frequencies in it. And it would also have more energy in the low frequencies because the amplitude of the low frequencies is usually greater than the amplitude of the high frequencies. That's a really important thing. Let me illustrate a way that you can remember this. So after class, you're standing outside a club. There's a band playing in the club, and you're standing outside. What are you hearing? You're hearing coming out of the club, right? Why is it you only hear that and not the high frequencies? Because there's more energy in the low frequencies and enough energy to make it through the walls so that you actually hear it outside. The minute you open the door, you start hearing the high frequency crashing of cymbals. The high frequency doesn't have enough energy to make it through the barrier of the wall, where the low frequency has a lot of energy so it can make it through the barrier. So that's sort of a way to remember in your head. In a complex sound, low frequencies have more energy and high frequencies have less energy. Low frequencies have a long wavelength and moves a lot of air to create one cycle, and high frequencies are much smaller. Another good way to remember it is if you've got a speaker system at home, there's a tweeter perhaps and a woofer. The woofer is for low frequencies. It's bigger. The tweeter is much smaller. Tweeter is for high frequencies. So high frequencies doesn't take a lot of energy to move a little bit of air. But low frequencies needs a bigger speaker to move more air and more energy to create low frequencies. This is going to be one basic fundamental concept about how sound behaves. Let's jump ahead to the actual recording process and recording arts and how this all relates. Well, it's true that low frequencies are very difficult to mix properly. It's either too woofy sounding or not enough bottom end, or it's muddy and non-defined and you can't quite understand. Why can't I mix the low frequencies where the high frequencies I can always mix? It's because low frequencies are such long wavelengths. You have to have a speaker system that can actually create those wavelengths so that you can accurately hear them. If you can't hear them, you can't know how much or how little you're adding into the mix. It's kind of like if you're wearing sunglasses all day, you don't really know how bright it is outside. So you have to be able to hear what you're really listening to. And that boils down to what studio monitors are supposed to be. Studio monitors aren't supposed to be hi-fi speakers that sound amazing. They're supposed to be flat and honest, like a clear piece of glass in your glasses, and not making things look better than they do look or sound. It's really important to understand that if you can't hear it properly and in balance, you can't mix it properly. You can guess. But then when you go to another speaker system, it's going to sound different. Go to another speaker system, you play it on your computer, play it on your iPod, whatever, it's all going to sound different in different places based upon how well that system recreates what you mixed. The object of mixing isn't necessarily making it perfect, but it's the object of really mixing for commercial exploitation is making it sound the best it can sound on all systems. So not just the best on the best hi-fi, but you want it to sound the best that it can on your computer speakers, your headphones, and a great hi-fi. You have a hard target to hit sometimes. That's why it's so difficult. So let's keep proceeding. So really important is that low frequencies carry more energy than high frequencies. Low frequencies are really long compared to high frequencies. 2.2 kilohertz is about 6 inches, where 20 kilohertz is going to be like a tenth of that. It's really small. We can still hear that, and we can hear 40 hertz, which is a wavelength the size of the room. Low frequencies would be a timpani, a cello, low end of a piano. That's low frequencies. Even though it has high frequencies in it, it's primarily low frequencies, where high frequencies would be things like shakers, tambourines, cymbals, high notes on a piano, piccolos in an orchestra, tuba, low end, bass singers, low frequencies, sopranos, higher frequencies. Property of sound waves. So now let's say we're dealing with more than one sound wave, because in general, I'm talking really simplistic when we're talking about one frequency. But let's say we're talking about two waves, and the relationship between the two waves in time is called the phase. You have to have one frequency as a reference, and how that other one relates is the phase. And here's an example of that. In phase creates constructive interference so that the wave becomes twice the amplitude of either one of them. 180 degrees out of phase becomes destructive interference, where you destroy the wave. This is an important concept of phase relationship of one sound to the next. Let me give you an example, more practical example, so that we're not just talking theoretical, oh, that's a nice wave. Well, let's say I'm speaking to you, you're hearing the sound as it hits your ear, and you're close to me. Back of the room, they're further away. They're hearing the sound when it hits their ears, but we know sound takes time to travel because it has a speed, just like a car. So I'm speaking, you're hearing me before they are. But let's say that they were far enough away and I was emitting one frequency and they were out of phase with what you were hearing. By the time it got to them, it was halfway through the cycle. So they're actually hearing me a little differently, but let's say you're not human beings, let's say you're microphones instead. And then we take them and we record them and add them together in our recording. If we're 180 degrees out of phase, we're going to destroy that frequency. So effects of phasing. Two sine waves with the same frequency at different amplitudes and phase result in a sine wave with the same frequency but a new amplitude and phase. This is what we do all day long when we've got multiple microphones recording things. Not just one vocal mic for a vocalist, but multiple microphones. Say we're recording a drum kit and we've got 8 different microphones. And they're all different distances from different drums. And they're all receiving sound from all the drums. That means that they're all out of phase with each other. So the difference between a good drum sound and a bad drum sound, on a more practical level, is how you deal with the phasing issues between the microphones. Am I motivating people to understand why it's important? So it really does matter that sound takes time to travel. So every time you put a microphone up and a second microphone, if they're not in the identically same spot, you're going to get some phasing. And that phasing at a specific frequency is going to be 180 degrees, and they're going to cancel that frequency out. Luckily, most sounds are more than one frequency, so you don't cancel the entire sound. You just have little pockets of frequencies that are canceled out. And that's the art of placing microphones, knowing how to make it sound the best that it can sound. We'll go through a lot of techniques, but I'm trying to motivate you to understand why it's important. Anybody that's tried to record something and it sounded rotten, there could be reasons. These are some of the reasons.